November 1895. Behind a locked door on Fifth Avenue, a 17-year-old girl sits in her wedding gown and cries until her face swells. Downstairs, an orchestra is playing Wagner for guests who have no idea the bride upstairs has spent the morning wondering if she could still run. She will not run. In 20 minutes, she will walk down an aisle toward a man she does not love, wearing a title her mother wanted more than she ever wanted anything for herself. Her name is Consuelo Vanderbilt, and this is not a fairy tale. This is a story about what happens when a girl is raised not to be loved, but to be used, and what she does with the rest of her life once the using is over. To understand what brought her to that locked door, you have to go back to the beginning, to a childhood that looked like unimaginable privilege and felt, to the girl living it, like a very well-decorated cage. Consuelo was born in 1877 into the Vanderbilt family, heirs to one of the largest fortunes in America. Railroads, shipping, more money than most European royal houses. But American money in the 1870s bought you almost nothing in the one currency that mattered to the old aristocracies of Europe: pedigree. Her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, understood this instinctively, and she built her entire life's project around fixing it. Alva had clawed her own family into the top ranks of New York society through sheer will, hosting balls so extravagant they forced the old Knickerbocker families to finally acknowledge the Vanderbilts existed. Having conquered New York, Alva set her sights on something bigger. A title. Not for herself, for her daughter. From the time Consuelo could walk, she was being built, not raised. A steel rod was strapped down her spine to force perfect posture. She was corrected for the shape of her nose, the pitch of her voice, the way she held a fork. Alva later admitted, in her own words, that she whipped her daughter for slouching. When Consuelo asked questions, she was told she didn't need opinions, only manners. Her days were scheduled to the half hour. Lessons in French, deportment, music, a strict 30 minutes permitted for conversation with her own mother. What Alva could not fully control was what was happening inside her daughter's head. Consuelo read constantly: history, poetry, the stories of women who had resisted power rather than married into it. She found more kinship with the poor orphans in Dickens than with the debutantes she was groomed to become. It was a quiet, private rebellion that nobody in that house noticed, because it didn't show on the outside. On the outside, she was exactly what Alva was building: beautiful, composed, and marketable. At 17, on a tour of Europe with her family, something happened that had never happened to Consuelo before. She was given a choice. She fell in love, genuinely, mutually, with an American named Winthrop Rutherford. He wasn't a fortune hunter. He didn't need her money and didn't perform for her mother. He simply spoke to her like a person. When he asked her to marry him, she said yes, and for the first time in her life, it was a decision she had made for herself. Alva ended it within weeks. She intercepted letters, dismissed staff who were sympathetic to the match, and when Consuelo tried to hold her ground, Alva took to her bed, claiming heart failure, telling her daughter she would die of the betrayal. It worked. Consuelo, terrified she might actually kill her mother by choosing her own happiness, gave Rutherford up and never saw him again. Decades later, he would go on to marry Lucy Mercer, the same Lucy Mercer who became Franklin Roosevelt's lifelong mistress. Even the man Consuelo lost got tangled in someone else's complicated story. Nothing about this era, it seems, ran in straight lines. With the one match Consuelo actually wanted destroyed, Alva pivoted immediately to the one she had wanted all along: Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, a young English aristocrat whose family seat, Blenheim Palace, was magnificent, historic, and quietly falling apart from lack of money. The Duke needed cash. Alva needed a title. Consuelo needed, apparently, nothing that anyone in the room considered relevant. The marriage settlement was reported at the time at around $2.5 million in railroad stock, an extraordinary sum, enough to repair a palace, and Consuelo would later be blunt about the arrangement in her own memoir. She had been traded, not courted. Which brings us back to that locked door on Fifth Avenue, November 6th, 1895. She did not run. She walked down the aisle, married a man she'd barely spoken to, and became the Duchess of Marlborough before her 18th birthday. There was no honeymoon in any real sense. The Duke, called Sonny, ironically, by his family, was polite, correct, and almost entirely absent emotionally. He complimented her posture at breakfast and little else. They arrived at Blenheim Palace to find a house that impressed everyone who saw it and comforted no one who lived in it. Enormous, cold, built 3 centuries earlier as a monument to a military victory, not a home for 2 young strangers with nothing to say to each other. Consuelo later wrote that she had gained a grand title and lost almost everything else. She gave the Marlborough line its heir, a son named John, and later a second son, Ivor, coining in the process a phrase that's still used today, an heir and a spare. Even motherhood was managed for her. A nanny was installed immediately, and she was told, in essence, that too much affection would spoil a future duke. For years, she performed the role exactly as required. She hosted, she curtsied, she smiled at diplomats. And slowly, almost without noticing when it started, she began doing something else, too. She started visiting the villages near Blenheim, the schools, the almshouses, the families who had nothing and asked for nothing. Unlike the palace, they didn't care what her waist measured or what her title was. They just noticed that she kept coming back. That instinct became the hinge her whole life turned on. When her marriage finally collapsed, a quiet separation in 1906, no scandal, just a letter, Consuelo didn't retreat from public life. She expanded into it. In London, she opened a home for the wives of imprisoned men, women left destitute with children and no support. She sat, the only woman in the room, on a national commission investigating Britain's birth rate, and described overcrowded tenements and malnourished infants to an audience of doctors and clergymen who had never had to look at any of it directly. In 1917, she ran for the London County Council and won, campaigning on housing and child welfare in a working-class district that had never had a duchess ask what it actually needed. Children in the street reportedly sang a little rhyme, urging people to vote for Mrs. Marlborough. She had gone, in the language of the press at the time, from ornament to what one newspaper called simply the working duchess. Her mother, meanwhile, was undergoing her own transformation. Alva Vanderbilt, the same woman who had broken her daughter's engagement and pushed her into a loveless marriage for a title, threw herself into the suffrage movement with the same ferocious will she'd once used to build a social empire, eventually becoming president of the National Women's Party. It would be too simple to call this an apology, but something did shift between them. Alva began writing to her daughter not with instructions, but with something closer to respect. It was not forgiveness delivered in a single dramatic scene. It was 2 women who had fought very different wars, slowly recognizing each other as allies. World War I arrived, and with it, more work. Consuelo helped organize hospitals, ran relief committees, and converted parts of her own household into wartime shelter for unmarried mothers and their children, at a time when that kind of open compassion for illegitimate births carried real social risk. She gave a public lecture on infant mortality that named, bluntly, the things polite society preferred not to discuss: poverty, venereal disease, the simple lack of clean milk. And some of the audience walked out. Others called it the bravest thing they'd heard from a woman of her class in years. In 1921, the marriage that had begun as a transaction ended as one too. A quiet divorce, no scandal in the papers, mutual consent. 5 years later, with the help of her mother's own testimony to Rome, Alva admitting formally that she had coerced her daughter into the marriage in the first place, the union was annulled by the Catholic Church, clearing the way for Consuelo to remarry within it. That same year, 1921, she had already married again, Jacques Balsan, a French aviation pioneer who had once flown hot air balloons across Europe and later helped found what became the first American fighter squadron of the war. By every account, it was the first relationship in her adult life she had actually chosen and kept. He didn't need to impress anyone. He simply, finally, gave her a quiet kind of partnership she'd never been permitted before. In France, she kept working. Alongside the heiress Winnaretta Singer, she helped found a hospital outside Paris in the late 1920s, built not for the wealthy who had private doctors, and not for the destitute who had charity wards, but for the middle class, who usually had nothing at all. Around 1947, 2 years after the war that had scattered her family across armies and continents, the French government made her an officer of the Legion of Honor for a lifetime of public relief work, an honor by then that read less like a decoration and more like a confirmation of who she had actually become. Her mother died in 1933. There was no reconciliation scene worthy of a film. Just 2 women, once locked in the fiercest kind of war a mother and daughter can wage, sitting quietly together in the years before the end. Consuelo would later write that her mother had taught her strength. It took her decades to also learn forgiveness. She and Jacques Balsan built a long, ordinary, contented life together, a rarity given where she'd started. He died in 1956. Consuelo lived another 8 years, largely in the United States, dividing her time between Florida, Manhattan, and eventually a house in Southampton on Long Island. Not the England she'd once been sold into, but the America she'd been sold out of. She published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, in 1953, clear-eyed, unsentimental, more interested in what she'd learned than in what she'd suffered. She died there, in Southampton, New York, in December 1964, at 87. Her ashes were sent back to England regardless. Not to a grand hall, but to the small churchyard at Bladden, within walking distance of the palace that had once claimed her, where she rests beside her elder son. History still hasn't fully decided what to make of her. Was she simply a casualty of her mother's ambition, traded across an ocean for a crumbling palace's repair bill? Or was she something more deliberate, a woman who understood, long before it was fashionable to say so, that she could not choose the hand she was dealt, but could still choose what she did with it? Maybe the honest answer is that she was both, at different points in the same life. The girl who cried behind a locked door and the woman who stood before a royal commission were, unmistakably, the same person. She simply took the second half of her life back. So, what can we learn from Consuelo Vanderbilt's life? First, the circumstances you're born into don't determine the leader you become. Consuelo never chose the life that was planned for her, but she chose how she would respond to it. Real leadership isn't about having perfect conditions. It's about deciding what you'll build with the ones you have. Second, true influence comes from serving others, not from status. Consuelo had wealth, a title, and one of the most famous names of her era, yet none of those became her greatest legacy. What people remembered was her compassion, her public service, and her willingness to improve the lives of those who had no voice. Because respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And third, Don't let your hardest chapter become your entire story. Consuelo could have remained a victim of her past. Instead, she transformed pain into purpose, resentment into compassion, and obligation into meaningful action. The strongest leaders aren't the ones who've never suffered. They're the ones who refuse to let suffering define who they become. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. You can't always choose the hand life deals you, but you can always choose what kind of person you'll become because of it. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, or share your thoughts in the comments. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us bring more remarkable stories like this to life, and it truly means a lot to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.